the bad, beat 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 the bad. Think happy thoughts. Richard the Film Geek here, and since I've recently turned 33 years old, I thought now would be just the perfect time for me to give you guys my review of the very first feature film adaptation in existence, namely the 1924 silent film adaptation of J.M. Barrie's timeless and iconic 1904 children's classic about confronting the societal expectations of growing up and or reaching adulthood, whilst at the same time staying true to yourself without losing sight of your inner child. Peter Pan. Pan. This particular version of the Peter Pan story was produced by Paramount Pictures and released on the 29th of December 1924, was adapted by Willis Goldbeck, obviously from the original Peter Pan stage play by J.M. Barrie, is apparently, in fact, the only film adaptation to be personally overseen by J.M. Barrie himself, was directed by Herbert Brenon, stars Betty Bronson, Ernest Torrance, Mary Bryan, Virginia Browne Faire, George Alley, Cyril Chadwick, Anna May Wong, and Esther Ralston, was apparently initially thought to be a lost film for decades prior to the 1940s, when only 2 copies of the film were rediscovered, both by a film preservationist in New York and by a film historian in the Disney Studio vaults, and has since only had a recent resurgence in relative popularity within the last few years, especially now that more and more people are becoming aware of this version's existence, largely thanks to YouTube, and is generally well regarded by film scholars, film fanatics, and film historians alike, a la the legendary Brian Sibley and Leonard Maltin, to be the version that literally gave Walt Disney himself the inspiration to make his own, arguably much more definitive and iconic animated feature film adaptation of the story nearly 30 years later. Pretty much surely everyone of all ages should be ridiculously familiar by now with the story of Peter Pan, especially if they've happened to read the book during their childhood, and or even seen any of the countless film, TV, and stage adaptations over the last 120 years since the story's inception, a la the live-action 2003 adaptation, Pan from 2015, Hook from 1991, the early 90s Fox animated series adaptation, Peter Pan and the Pirates, and or especially the aforementioned 1953 Disney animated film adaptation, as well as its theatrically released 2002 direct-to-DVD sequel, Return to Neverland, and rather unfortunately, its straight-to-Disney Plus 2023 live-action remake, Peter Pan and Wendy, but purely just for the sake of informing those who are somehow both still unfamiliar anyway with what is generally right up there with the likes of Wind in the Willows, Treasure Island, Winnie the Pooh, and Alice in Wonderland as one of the most popular, best known, and most celebrated stories to ever be written in the history of British children's literature, and still somehow don't believe in fairies. No offence. The story of Peter Pan primarily takes place in London, England, during the very early 20th century, and we particularly follow 2 central characters, one of which is a 12 or 13-year-old girl named Wendy Darling, who, even despite her father's stern practicality and his constant overbearing demands, feels extremely stubbornly reluctant to even contemplate or embrace the potential life-changing possibility of growing up and moving out of the family nursery, and would actually very much rather continue to escape this societal pressure and entertain her own childlike imagination, as well as that of her younger siblings, John and Michael, with fantastical, whimsical stories concerning the other central character in the story, namely the titular boy who would never grow up himself, Peter Pan, and his countless magical adventures in Neverland. Speaking of which, after Peter,
the definite article, you might say,
arrives through their bedroom window one night, along with his fairy companion Tinker Bell, and successfully manages to retrieve his lost shadow, he quickly strikes up a close friendship with the darling children, and particularly with Wendy, much to Tink's chagrin and jealous nature, and casually invites them to think the happiest of thoughts, have pixie dust sprinkled all over them, and fly away with him to embark on the ultimate magical childhood adventure of a lifetime in Neverland, where they encounter mermaids, fairies, Indians, crocodiles with ticking clocks, pirates, and Peter's very own little motley crew called the Lost Boys, as well as especially have to ultimately come face to face with the main villain of the story, namely Peter's ruthless, vengeful, and bloodthirsty pirate arch-nemesis, Captain James Hook, who himself has sworn revenge on the boy for cutting off his hand during a duel, of course leading to him wearing a deadly iron hook, hence the name, and feeding it, along with a tick-tocking clock, to a ravenous crocodile. So now that I've had the absolute great pleasure to check out for the very first time this particular silent film adaptation, and especially since after such a long time of waiting, this is actually the first silent film I'm reviewing on the channel, and I'm thus really looking forward to reviewing many more of these on the channel. Literally some of the very first films to ever be made. Here are my thoughts on Peter Pan 1924. Wow. Just wow. Even though the movie does admittedly play things safe by being based on the stage play, hence why the production feels more like you're in the audience watching the stage play come to life with groundbreaking visual effects for the time, which I am briefly going to get into later, then a cinematic, straightforward adaptation of the book, like most versions, which greatly works in this film's favour though, by retaining the cathartic moment from the stage play, where Peter breaks the fourth wall and encourages the audience to save Tink's life by loudly clapping. And even despite the questionably heavy-handed American patriotism, which you can otherwise easily forgive, I suppose, since this was, after all, a moderately big-budget Hollywood studio production at the time, as well as despite the even more questionable racial depictions of at least one of the pirates, and of course the Indians, hence the frankly rather unfortunate miscasting here of Chinese-American actress Anna-May Wong as Tiger Lily. I still really like and or maybe even love this particular adaptation of Peter Pan. Not only is this one of the more fun, enjoyable and entertaining experiences I've had in terms of silent films, and not only is this, in my opinion, one of the more faithful adaptations to its source material in terms of staying true to the spirit, the appeal, the childlike wonder, and even the magic of this immortal, timeless, classic and iconic story, even going as far as to incorporate a majority of the book's dialogue into the intertitles. But I'd also probably go as far on the record to say that this ranks right up there with the 1953 version, the 2003 version, and even Hook as one of my personal favourite adaptations of the Peter Pan story, period. You've also got to really admire the film's bravery and confidence to take quite a few substantial creative liberties with the story in order to make it stand out on its own. For example, by completely omitting the full skirmish on Skull Rock and instead saving the large majority of the action for the big climax at the end, and chiefly having Captain Hook feed the clock to the crocodile intentionally instead of by accident, only to then have the clock cleverly used against him by Peter at the end, and thus play an active part in his downfall. When it comes to the performances, everyone for the most part does a rock-solid job here, from the kids they got to portray John, Michael and the Lost Boys, to even the guys they got to portray Smee and the other pirates. Especially given that the character of Tinkerbell was previously portrayed as just a flashing ball of light in the original stage play. I genuinely do believe this was the very first attempt to go one step further and have the character be portrayed for the first time by an actual living, breathing actress. In this case being Virginia Browne Faire, who absolutely stuns in this movie as Tink, despite having less screen time than I thought she would. And surely she's mighty proud anyway that she helped lay the groundwork for future media interpretations of this character. The guy they got to portray not just Nana, but also the crocodile, George Alley, who, funnily enough, receives top billing in this movie. I mean, gotta love that logic, right? He does such an incredible job here, as does Mary Bryan, as by far one of the sweetest Wendy darlings ever put to celluloid. Even despite the fact that she basically bookends the movie, and even despite the fact that the filmmakers somehow either forgot to style her hair to look more period accurate, or just allowed her to keep her 1920s bob cut during the shoot, Esther Ralston still manages to shine in her substantial bit role as Mrs. Darling. Cyril Chadwick is just fine as Mr. Darling, even though I'm not exactly a fan of his characterization in the movie as this kind of oafish, almost intentionally cruel prankster towards both Michael and particularly Nana, especially at the beginning. Not that the guy does a terrible acting job per se, it's just that I think they made a slight mistake by diminishing his character's overall emotional significance to Wendy's character arc in the story. And thus I always very much preferred the idea that Mr. Darling is this overly practical, stubborn, and kind of grumpy workaholic. Almost similar, actually, to Robin Williams's performance as the Peter Banning side of Peter Pan in Hook, for example, who becomes so worked up and stressed out from the combined pressures of getting ready to attend this big evening party, having a dog, namely Nana, be the family nanny, and even having to contend with an only daughter who A, reluctantly refuses to grow up, and B, continues to feed her siblings so-called childish stories about this Peter Pan figure, that it causes him to go a bit too far, harshly berate Wendy for what she's doing, and devalue Nana's importance within the family by leaving her outside that night, which is precisely what both the 2003 and Disney versions handled so excellently. Not to mention as well that perhaps apart from Peter Pan and Wendy most recently, this is the only other film adaptation of this story to feature two separate actors in the roles of Mr. Darling and Captain Hook, as opposed to the much preferred established tradition of having both characters be portrayed by the same actor, as is the case obviously with Hans Conried and Jason Isaacs, for example, and really basically tapping into the idea that Captain Hook represents for Wendy really an exaggerated mirror image of how she perceives her own father, which subsequently adds a much deeper and complex emotional layer to Wendy and Hook's relationship throughout the story. Speaking of which, Ernest Torrance is also fine as Captain Hook. Don't get me wrong though, he does still do a decent and solid job with providing the perfect blend of legit comedy and legit menace you need for a character like this. He does look like he probably had a blast playing this role. Who wouldn't? And he is certainly much better in the role than, say, Rhys Ifans or Jude Law or Garrett Hedlund or, Christ, even Christopher Walken. But he's just not one of my personal favourite on-screen portrayals of Captain Hook, and thus not really quite in the same leagues as Hans Conried, Jason Isaacs, Tim Curry, and heck even Dustin Hoffman. Plus, on a side note, Had he not been too busy around this time with filming Phantom of the Opera for Universal after the success of The Hunchback of Notre Dame? I would actually love to have seen what Lon Chaney's take on Captain Hook would have looked like in this movie, especially with the man's legendary use of prosthetics and makeup to effectively change his appearance with every film he did, earning him the moniker the Man of 1,000 Faces. But the one true standout, and easily by far my favourite performance of the bunch in this movie, is Betty Bronson as probably one of the all-time most definitive portrayals of the titular boy who would never grow up in film history. Honestly, can we just give a massive, loud, slow clap here to the author J.M. Barrie for personally hand-selecting this extraordinarily talented gal to portray Peter Pan in this movie? To say that this piece of casting is so inspired and so pitch perfect is such a massive understatement. And granted, of course, that this was keeping with the tradition at the time of Peter being portrayed on stage by a woman, despite being written as a young male boy. But I thought Betty Bronson crushed it here with this performance. She just perfectly nails and encapsulates to the gills everything we love, admire, and cannot help but be fascinated by about this iconic character. The essence, the charm, the youthful, boyish energy, undying zest for life, and desire to physically remain a child and have fun, the endearing immaturity, the oblivious awkwardness he feels around Wendy, the manically gleeful expressions on her face when she's fighting Captain Hook, and especially the quiet, pained tragedy of never having grown up with a mother himself, and thus being unable to have more than platonic and affectionate feelings for a girl. Plus, she just rocks that iconic green tunic and costume, doesn't she? Speaking of which, actually, Herbert Brenon does such a solid job with his direction here. The cinematography, the costumes, the set design, and the production design all look amazing and just really help to fully immerse you in this world and perfectly give the film almost this lovely dreamlike visual quality to it, especially when you get to Neverland. The instrumental score by Philip C. Carley also perfectly aligns with the whimsical, light-hearted, childlike and magical tone of the story as well. And honestly, no wonder this was hailed by critics at the time as a groundbreaking visual effects achievement, because these aforementioned visuals still look incredible. Such a sight to behold, and have surprisingly aged really well, close to 101 years later. And of course, the very last thing I want to praise about this film, before I give my final thoughts here, is really the sheer cultural importance of this film, and just how damn lucky and grateful we are, at least, to have had this film come into existence as it is in the first place, and win over countless new generations of silent film fans and or film history enthusiasts in general to this day. Because imagine otherwise if this remained a lost film, alongside the likes, for example, of London After Midnight and Dracula's Death. We would probably never have gotten future adaptations of this story in the same way we do now. Walt Disney would probably never have gotten the core inspiration he needed for his company's very own animated film adaptation, maybe perhaps aside from the book and the stage play. And actually, in turn, that animated film would probably never have turned out as richly and successfully as it did back in 1953. In conclusion, even despite its very few minor drawbacks, Peter Pan 1924 still remains, in my opinion, to be such a magical, 99% faithful, underrated and fantastic adaptation, as well as a true landmark achievement in visual effects filmmaking. It becomes very easy to tell within every single frame how much time, effort, attention to detail, and passion went into the making of this film, as well as how much the filmmakers completely understood the core universal appeal to both kids and adults of this source material, and thus really wanted to do the story of Peter Pan true justice for the very first time on film, whilst at the same time being unafraid and brave to take some creative liberties to make the film stand out on its own. If, like me, you're in a curious enough mood to want to check out a much older film adaptation of a familiar classic story like Peter Pan, and or if you're a general fan of silent films, there are multiple uploads from several different channels of this film that are freely available to watch in their entirety here on YouTube. Some without the incidental score, and some preferably with the incidental score, which I would very highly recommend. Plus, I will very kindly leave a link to the version of the film I watched in preparation for this review down in the description for you to check out for yourself. And with all that being said, my overall rating for Peter Pan 1924 shall be a 9 out of 10. Don't forget to do the following few things as always. Leave a comment below. Let me know your thoughts on Peter Pan 1924. Subscribe to my channel. Click on the little bell to receive any emailed notifications and or updates from the channel. If you haven't already, you can also follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Letterboxd, and Blue Sky. Do take care, everyone, and remember, think the happiest of thoughts, because to always have faith, trust, and pixie dust will be an awfully big adventure.